Detective Maria Chen would never forget the smell that hit her when they opened the cellar door at 1247 Meridian Street. It wasn't just the mustiness of a room that hadn't seen daylight in years. It wasn't the dampness or the rot. It was something else, something that made her 20 years on the force feel inadequate. Behind that door, they found chains bolted to the wall, a mattress stained with things she didn't want to identify, and scratches on the concrete floor that spelled out names. 17 names. 17 women who had walked into the Everhart sisters' house and never walked out. But what haunted Maria most wasn't what they found in that cellar. It was the woman they found 3 blocks away, sitting on a park bench at 4 in the morning, covered in blood that wasn't hers, clutching a leather notebook like it was the only thing tethering her to reality. The woman looked up at Maria with eyes that had seen hell, and she said 5 words that would break the case wide open. "I have all their names. The Angels of Meridian Street." The neighborhood called them the Angel Sisters, and for a time, that's exactly what Diane and Margaret Everhart appeared to be. In a part of the city where hope came at a premium and second chances were rarer than honest politicians, the Everharts opened their doors to women the world had given up on. The house itself seemed designed for redemption, a sprawling Victorian painted in soft yellow with white trim, flower boxes under every window, and a wraparound porch where women could sit and watch the world go by without fear. A hand-painted sign hung above the door, Haven House, where every woman deserves a second chance. Diane was the face of the operation. 56 years old, with silver hair she wore in a neat bun and reading glasses that hung from a chain around her neck. She had the kind of voice that could make you feel like you mattered, like your story was important, like she understood every disappointment and heartbreak that had led you to her door. She volunteered at the women's shelter downtown, attended every city council meeting about housing and homeless services, and spoke eloquently about the failures of the system to protect society's most vulnerable. The mayor had her phone number. The local news interviewed her twice a year. She was, by all appearances, a woman dedicated to making a difference. Margaret was quieter, 2 years older than Diane, with the same silver hair but sharper features and eyes that always seemed to be calculating something just behind the surface. She handled the finances, managed the house, kept the books that showed Haven House running on donations and grants, and the modest fees they charged residents who could afford to pay. She was the practical one, people said, the one who made sure Diane's compassion didn't bankrupt them. Together, they were formidable, a perfect partnership of heart and head, saving one woman at a time. The first woman to disappear was named Crystal Mendez, 24 years old, with a history of addiction and a daughter in the foster care system. She was desperate to get back. She'd been at Haven House for 8 months, the longest she'd stayed anywhere since she was 16. She'd gotten clean, found work at a dry cleaner, started supervised visits with her daughter. She was 3 weeks away from a custody hearing when she vanished. The sisters told the social worker that Crystal had relapsed, had stolen money from the house safe, and disappeared in the middle of the night. It was devastating but not surprising. Everyone who worked with women like Crystal knew the statistics, knew how often the story ended in relapse and failure. The social worker was sad but not shocked. Crystal's daughter was placed in a long-term foster home. The case was closed, except Crystal hadn't relapsed. Crystal had discovered what Haven House really was. It started the way it always started, with kindness that felt too good to be true. Alexis Durham arrived on a Tuesday in February, 21 years old, running from an ex-boyfriend who'd put her in the hospital twice and promised the third time would be the last. She had a restraining order that meant nothing and nowhere to go that he wouldn't find her. A woman at the domestic violence hotline told her about Haven House, about the Everhart sisters who helped women disappear from dangerous situations, who didn't ask too many questions and didn't report to any official agencies that might have to disclose her location. Diane met Alexis at a coffee shop 3 blocks from the house. She was warm and maternal, asked gentle questions, and promised absolute safety. Haven House wasn't just a shelter, Diane explained. It was a community of women helping women, completely off the grid, completely private. No case managers, no social workers checking in, no paperwork that could be subpoenaed. Just a safe place to heal and start over. The rent was reasonable, $200 a week, which included meals and utilities. Alexis could stay as long as she needed. It sounded perfect. It sounded like salvation. The house was even better than Alexis imagined. Her room was on the second floor, clean and furnished with actual care, not the institutional minimalism of every shelter she'd stayed in before. There were curtains on the windows, art on the walls, a quilt on the bed that someone had clearly made by hand. The bathroom down the hall had good water pressure and shelves stocked with shampoo and soap and tampons. The kitchen smelled like something homemade. There were 6 other women living there, ranging from 19 to 35, all with their own stories of escape and survival. For the first 3 weeks, it was everything Diane had promised. Alexis felt safe for the first time in 2 years. She slept through the night without waking up at every sound. She started looking for work, started thinking about what kind of life she might build. She made friends with the other women, particularly with a 28-year-old named Brooklyn who'd been at the house for 5 months and seemed to have it together. Brooklyn had a job at a call center, was saving money, talked about getting her own apartment soon. Then Alexis noticed the cameras. They were small, discreet, hidden in smoke detectors and air vents, but once she spotted one, she started seeing them everywhere. In the hallways, in the common areas, pointed at the front door and back door. Even one in the bathroom, which made her stomach turn. She asked Brooklyn about them, trying to keep her voice casual. Brooklyn's expression changed, became guarded. She told Alexis that the cameras were for safety, to make sure no dangerous men could find the women here. It made sense. It was reasonable. But something in Brooklyn's tone suggested she didn't quite believe it herself. The next thing Alexis noticed was the money. Diane had said rent was $200 a week, but at the end of the first month, Margaret presented her with a bill for $800 plus an additional $600 for program fees, security deposits, and administrative costs. Alexis said there must be a mistake. That Diane had never mentioned these fees. Margaret's expression didn't change. She explained calmly that all residents signed a contract agreeing to these terms. Alexis insisted she'd never signed anything. Margaret produced a document with Alexis's signature at the bottom, except Alexis had no memory of signing it, and the terms outlined in the contract were nothing like what Diane had described. The debt was $1,400. Alexis had $300 to her name. Margaret suggested she might want to consider additional income opportunities. There were men who came to the house, respectable men, who paid for companionship. Nothing illegal, Margaret assured her. Just conversation. Maybe a drink, maybe a massage. The house would take a small percentage, and Alexis could pay off her debt in a few weeks. Alexis said no. She said she'd find another job, work double shifts, but she wasn't doing that. Margaret smiled and said that was fine, but the debt was still due, and if Alexis couldn't pay, she'd need to leave Haven House. And if she left, well, Margaret hoped Alexis understood that they'd need to report her location to certain parties. Nothing personal, just business. They had their own protection to... Oh, think about. It would be terrible if her ex-boyfriend found out where she'd been staying. The threat was clear. The choice was no choice at all. That night, Alexis sat in the parlor with a 53-year-old insurance adjuster who paid the house $150 for an hour of her time. She smiled and nodded, and let him touch her hand while he talked about his wife who didn't understand him. Afterward, Margaret gave her $60. The house kept $90. The debt was now $1,340. This was how it worked. This was how it had always worked. The Everhart sisters had refined the system over 15 years, operating in 5 different cities under 4 different names before settling in at 1247 Meridian Street. They targeted vulnerable women, women with no family or resources, women running from something or someone, women who couldn't go to the police. They offered salvation and delivered slavery. The debt was designed to be impossible to pay off. The clients paid more for more explicit services. The cameras ensured compliance and created insurance. Any woman who threatened to go to the authorities would find herself facing revenge porn, blackmail, or worse. Most women eventually broke. They accepted their situation. They survived. Some even convinced themselves it wasn't that bad, that they were making choices, that it could be worse. The sisters were careful to allow small freedoms, to let the women leave the house for work or errands, to maintain the illusion of choice. The invisible chains were stronger than physical ones. Shame, debt, fear, and isolation kept the women trapped more effectively than any lock. But some women didn't break. Some women fought back. Some women became problems. And problems, as Margaret liked to say, needed to be solved. Crystal had been a problem. She'd threatened to go to the police, had tried to contact her daughter's social worker, had attempted to run. They'd caught her at the bus station, brought her back, and explained very carefully what would happen if she tried again. They showed her videos from the cameras, explained how those videos would be sent to her daughter's foster family, to the judge overseeing her custody case, to everyone she'd ever known. Crystal stopped fighting after that. She became compliant, docile even. For 2 months she did what was asked without complaint. Then one night she overheard Margaret and Diane talking in the office. She heard them discussing her, discussing the custody hearing, discussing the liability she represented once she got her daughter back and no longer needed Haven House. She heard Margaret say the words permanent solution. She heard Diane agree. Crystal ran that night. She made it 6 blocks before Curtis, the man the sisters employed for security and enforcement, caught her. What happened next, no one knew for certain. Crystal never came back to Haven House. The sisters told the other women she'd relapsed and left. They told the social worker the same thing. They collected Crystal's belongings, cleaned her room, and welcomed a new resident the following week. But Crystal had told someone about the house, about what the sisters were doing. She'd confided in another woman, a 30-year-old named Jasmine, who'd been at Haven House for 7 months. Jasmine was smart enough not to ask questions, not to house suspicion, but she started paying attention. She noticed other things. She remembered other women who'd left suddenly over the past months. She started keeping track. 3 months after Crystal disappeared, another woman vanished. Her name was Trinity, 19 years old, too young and too scared to be careful about what she said. She'd told one of the clients she was thinking about going to the police. The client told the sisters. Trinity was gone the next day. Jasmine knew she needed to be more careful. She needed evidence. She needed help. But everyone in the house was either too broken or too afraid. The new women were still in the honeymoon phase, still believing the sisters' kindness was real. The longer-term residents had learned not to make waves. Jasmine felt increasingly alone, increasingly certain that if she made one wrong move, she'd disappear too. Then Alexis arrived, and Jasmine saw something in her that had been absent in the other women. Alexis was angry. Underneath the fear and the trauma, there was rage that hadn't been extinguished yet. Jasmine recognized it because she'd had it once too, before months at Haven House had worn her down. But seeing it in Alexis rekindled something, made her think that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out. Jasmine started leaving notes for Alexis, small pieces of paper slipped under her door late at night. The first one said, "The cameras record everything, be careful." The second said, "Women have disappeared from this house. This is not paranoia." The third said, "If you want to know the truth, meet me in the garden at 3 a.m. Come alone." Alexis almost didn't go. It could be a trap, a test to see if she was becoming a problem, but something in those notes felt genuine, felt desperate. At 2:58 a.m. she crept downstairs and out to the small garden behind the house. Jasmine was already there, sitting on a stone bench under a willow tree, smoking a cigarette with shaking hands. What Jasmine told her over the next hour shattered any remaining illusions Alexis had about Haven House. She told her about Crystal, about Trinity, about at least 3 other women Jasmine suspected had met the same fate. She told her about the basement, about the room down there that was always locked, about the night she'd heard screaming from below and found the basement door open just a crack. She'd seen stairs leading down into darkness, and she'd heard Margaret's voice saying something about disposal and costs and efficiency. Alexis felt her blood turn to ice. She asked Jasmine why she was still here, why she hadn't run. Jasmine laughed, a sound without humor. She explained about the cameras, about the blackmail material, about the fact that she had a sister in college who couldn't afford to have her reputation destroyed by association. The sisters had made it clear what would happen if Jasmine left or talked. She was trapped in a nightmare that only ended one way, unless they found a way to end it differently, unless they gathered evidence, unless they found someone who could help them, someone with power the sisters couldn't touch. Alexis asked who that could possibly be. Everyone loved the Angel sisters. Everyone thought they were heroes. Who would believe two desperate women over the city's most beloved philanthropists? Jasmine had been thinking about that. There was a detective, a woman named Maria Chen, who'd worked a human trafficking case 2 years ago. Jasmine had read about her in the paper, about how she'd taken down a prostitution ring operating out of massage parlors in Chinatown. Chen had a reputation for believing victims, for going after powerful people. If they could get evidence to her, real evidence, maybe she'd listen. The problem was getting evidence without getting caught. The sisters were meticulous. They kept their records encrypted and backed up off-site. The cameras were monitored. Curtis was always watching. One suspicious move, and they'd end up like Crystal and Trinity. They needed help from the inside. They needed one of the other women to join them. Alexis suggested Brooklyn, who'd been at the house longest, who seemed to have the sisters' trust. Jasmine shook her head. Brooklyn was too far gone, too compliant. The sisters had broken something essential in her. But there was someone else, a woman who'd arrived just a week ago. Her name was Sierra, 26 years old, and she had something none of the other women had. She was a paralegal who'd fled after discovering her boss was embezzling client funds and had threatened to kill her if she went to the authorities. Sierra understood evidence. She understood the law, and according to Jasmine, she still had fight in her eyes. They recruited Sierra 3 nights later in the same garden at the same hour. Sierra listened to everything, asked pointed questions, and agreed to help. But she had one condition. They couldn't just expose the sisters. They needed to make sure every woman who disappeared got justice. They needed to find out what had happened to them, where they were. Dead or alive, those women deserved to be found. The 3 of them became a quiet conspiracy, meeting in stolen moments, communicating through careful glances and hidden notes. Sierra used her paralegal training to study the sisters' patterns, to figure out when they were most distracted, when the office might be unguarded. Jasmine used her months of observation to map the house's blind spots, the few places the cameras couldn't see. Alexis, with her fresh anger and determination, pushed them to move faster, to take risks, to remember that every day they waited was another day someone might disappear. It took 6 weeks to find an opportunity. The sisters were hosting a fundraiser at a hotel downtown, a gala for donors and city officials. They'd be gone from 6 p.m. until midnight at least. Curtis would be with them, providing security. The house would be staffed by 2 women the sisters trusted implicitly, residents who'd been there for years and had become enforcers themselves, benefiting from the system by helping to control the newer women. But Sierra had noticed that on Friday nights, these 2 women liked to drink, liked to relax once they were sure everyone was in their rooms. The plan was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. They'd wait until the enforcers were drunk, until the house was quiet. Then they'd break into the office, find whatever records they could, photograph everything, and get out. If they found evidence of what happened to the missing women, they'd take it directly to Detective Chen. If they got caught, well, none of them wanted to think about that. Friday came. The sisters left for the gala in a town car, Margaret in a black dress that probably cost more than any of the residents made in a month. Diane smiling and waving like the benevolent savior she pretended to be. Curtis drove them, wearing a suit that didn't quite fit his enforcer's frame. The 2 resident enforcers, women named Shanice and Crystal, settled in the living room with a bottle of vodka and reality TV. At 11:47 p.m., when Shanice and Crystal were slurring their words and barely conscious, Sierra, Jasmine, and Alexis crept downstairs. The office door was locked, but Sierra had stolen a copy of the keys weeks ago, had practiced opening the door silently in her mind 100 times. Her hands shook so badly she almost dropped the keys, but on the 3rd try the lock clicked open. The office was exactly what they expected, all dark wood and leather furniture, projecting respectability and success. There was a computer on the desk, password protected. Filing cabinets lined one wall. A small safe sat in the corner. They had maybe an hour before the sisters returned, maybe less. They couldn't waste a second. Sierra went for the filing cabinets while Jasmine tried passwords on the computer, and Alexis searched the desk. They found contracts, financial records, spreadsheets tracking the women's debts and earnings, invoices for services that made Alexis want to vomit. They photographed everything with phones they'd hidden in their rooms, phones the sisters didn't know about, purchased with money they'd skimmed and saved for months. Then Jasmine found the file. It was in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet, tucked behind tax documents and vendor contracts. It was labeled simply Archives, and inside were manila folders, each one containing a photograph, a name, dates, and a single sheet of paper with handwritten notes. Crystal Mendez became unstable, made threats. Removed March 17, 2019. Disposal handled by C, no complications. Trinity, Washington, security liability. Removed September 23, 2019. Disposal handled by C, no complications. There were 17 folders total. 17 women, 17 murders documented in neat handwriting as if they were nothing more than business transactions. Alexis heard Jasmine make a sound like something dying. Sierra's face had gone white. They knew the sisters were evil. They knew women had disappeared. But seeing it documented, seeing the cold efficiency of murder reduced to paperwork, was something else entirely. Something that made the room feel like it was closing in, like the air had turned to poison. They photographed every page of every folder with shaking hands and tear-blurred vision. They were almost finished when they heard the front door open downstairs. The sisters were home early. They heard Diane's voice, high and worried, saying something about a text message from Shanice that didn't make sense. They heard Curtis's heavy footsteps heading for the living room. They had maybe 60 seconds before the sisters came upstairs, maybe less. Sierra grabbed the archives file, made a split-second decision that they needed the original documents, not just photographs. Jasmine shoved everything back into the filing cabinets as quietly as she could. Alexis relocked the office door from inside, and they slipped out through the office window onto the second-floor roof, something Sierra had identified weeks ago as a potential escape route. They crawled across the roof in the arc, trying not to make noise, trying not to think about the 20-foot drop to the ground below. They heard shouting from inside the house, heard Margaret's voice sharp with anger, heard Curtis running up the stairs. They reached the oak tree at the corner of the house, the one whose branches came close enough to the roof that a desperate person might be able to reach them. Jasmine went first, jumping for a branch that bent under her weight but held. Sierra went next, still clutching the archives file. Alexis went last, hearing the office windows slam open above her, hearing Margaret's voice screaming for Curtis. She jumped, caught the branch, felt her hands slipping, held on through sheer terror. They climbed down in the darkness, dropped to the ground and ran. They ran through the neighborhood, in the middle of the night. 3 women in pajamas and stolen jackets, clutching evidence of 17 murders, not knowing if Curtis was behind them, not daring to look back. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs gave out, until they reached a 24-hour convenience store 6 blocks from Haven House. The clerk took one look at them and reached for the phone, probably thinking they were on drugs or fleeing domestic violence. Sierra grabbed the phone from his hand and dialed 911 herself. When the operator answered, Sierra said 4 words, "We need Detective Chen." The reckoning. Detective Maria Chen got the call at 1:47 in the morning. She'd been asleep for exactly 38 minutes after working a double shift on a gang shooting case. The dispatcher said there were 3 women at a convenience store on Fletcher Avenue claiming to have evidence of multiple homicides, refusing to talk to anyone but Chen specifically. They were terrified, possibly in shock, and kept saying something about angels and a house and women who'd disappeared. The dispatcher thought they might be mentally ill or high, but something in their voices made her think Chen should check it out. Maria arrived at the store 17 minutes later, still in the sweatpants and northwestern hoodie she'd been sleeping in, badge clipped to her waistband, service weapon secured. She'd been a detective for 12 years, had worked homicide, sex crimes, human trafficking. She'd seen things that made her question humanity's capacity for empathy, but she'd also learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts told her that the dispatcher was right to call her. The 3 women were huddled in the back of the store, near the refrigerated drinks, wrapped in blankets the clerk had given them. They looked young, scared, and utterly exhausted. The tallest one, with dark skin and braids, stood up when Maria entered and said, "Are you Detective Chen?" Maria confirmed she was. The woman introduced herself as Sierra Lawson, and said they needed to talk somewhere private, somewhere the Everhart sisters couldn't find them. The name triggered something in Maria's memory. Everhart. She'd heard it before. She pulled out her phone, did a quick search, and found dozens of news articles about the Angel Sisters of Meridian Street, the philanthropists who ran Haven House, who'd been nominated for humanitarian awards, who'd helped hundreds of women. Sierra saw Maria's expression and said, "Whatever you're reading, it's a lie. Those women are monsters, and we have proof." They went to the precinct. Maria set them up in an interview room with coffee and vending machine snacks and asked them to start from the beginning. What came out over the next 4 hours was the most comprehensive account of human trafficking, coerced prostitution, and serial murder Maria had encountered in her career. Sierra did most of the talking, laying out the operation with the precision of someone who understood how evidence worked. Jasmine filled in details about the missing women, about the screaming from the basement, about the atmosphere of terror that pervaded the house. Alexis showed Maria the photographs on her phone, hundreds of images of contracts and financial records and spreadsheets documenting the exploitation of vulnerable women. Then Sierra placed the archives file on the table. Maria opened it and felt her stomach drop. 17 women, 17 murders documented in handwriting so neat it looked like someone's grocery list. She read through each folder, each casual notation of disposal, each life reduced to a few lines of text. She'd worked homicide for years, but this was different. This was systematic. This was business. Maria called her lieutenant at 6 a.m. She explained what she had, what the women had told her, what the file contained. The lieutenant was skeptical. The Everhart sisters were respected community members. They had relationships with the mayor's office, with city council, with the district attorney. Accusations like this, without corroborating evidence, could end Maria's career. Did she understand what she was doing? Maria said she understood, perfectly. She was requesting a search warrant for 1247 Meridian Street, for all financial records associated with Haven House and the Everhart sisters, and for any property they owned within a 100-mile radius. She was requesting forensic accounting, cadaver dogs, and a team experienced in human trafficking investigations. And she was requesting all of it immediately, before the sisters had a chance to destroy evidence or flee. The lieutenant said he'd make some calls. Maria went back to the interview room and told the 3 women they were safe now, that they'd done the right thing, that she believed them. Sierra started crying for the first time since arriving at the precinct. Jasmine asked if they'd really catch the sisters, if there would really be justice for Crystal and Trinity and all the others. Alexis just stared at the wall, looking like she couldn't quite believe they were still alive. The search warrant came through at 2 p.m. after the lieutenant had called in favors and convinced a judge that the evidence warranted immediate action. Maria assembled a team of 8 detectives, 4 uniformed officers, and 2 forensic specialists. They arrived at Haven House at 3:17 p.m., when the sisters would be conducting their weekly counseling sessions with residents, when Curtis would be on site, when they'd have the best chance of securing everyone before anyone could run or destroy evidence. Diane answered the door with her trademark warm smile, which faltered only slightly when she saw the badges and the warrant. She asked what this was about, maintained her composure, insisted there must be some mistake. Margaret appeared behind her, sharper and quicker to understand the situation. She asked to see the warrant, read it carefully, and told Diane not to say anything without their lawyer present. The house was exactly as the women had described it. Cameras everywhere, locked doors, a basement with a room that made the forensic team go silent when they opened it. The current residents were terrified, confused, some initially defending the sisters because they hadn't yet understood what Haven House really was. Curtis tried to run and was tackled in the backyard by 2 patrol officers. The sisters maintained their innocence, insisted this was all a misunderstanding, said that any allegations came from unstable women with mental health issues and drug problems. But the evidence told a different story. The computer files, once the encryption was broken, revealed financial records showing hundreds of thousands of dollars in unreported income from sex trafficking. The cameras had backed up footage showing women being forced into rooms with clients, Curtis physically restraining women who tried to leave, the sisters themselves counting cash and discussing which residents were becoming problems. And in the basement room, forensics found traces of blood, bleach, and DNA from at least 6 different individuals. The real breakthrough came when detectives executed search warrants on 3 properties the sisters owned in rural areas outside the city. At the second property, a 40-acre farm the sisters had purchased 18 months earlier. Cadaver dogs alerted near an old barn. What they found beneath the concrete floor would haunt everyone involved in the investigation. 5 bodies. Crystal Mendez, Trinity Washington, and 3 other women whose identities matched names in the archives file. They'd been buried in shallow graves, wrapped in plastic, disposed of like trash. The medical examiner determined they'd all died from blunt force trauma or strangulation. They'd all died terrified and alone, killed by people they'd trusted to save them. The remaining 12 women from the archives file were never found. Curtis, facing life in prison, eventually admitted that he'd disposed of bodies at various locations for the sisters over the past decade, but he claimed he couldn't remember exactly where. Investigators suspected he was lying, protecting the sisters in some final twisted loyalty, but they couldn't prove it. 12 families would never know what happened to their daughters, sisters, mothers. 12 women would remain missing, remembered only by their names in a file and the women who'd fought to expose their murders. The trial began 8 months later and lasted 14 weeks. The prosecution presented testimony from Sierra, Jasmine, and Alexis, along with 19 other women who'd been at Haven House over the years and came forward after the arrests. Some had been there for weeks, some for years. All of them testified about the debt traps, the forced prostitution, the atmosphere of terror. All of them had stories about women who'd disappeared. The defense tried to discredit the witnesses, painting them as sex workers and addicts who'd exploited the sisters' kindness and were now lying for revenge or settlement money. The defense presented character witnesses who testified about the sisters' charitable work, their decades of community service, the hundreds of women they'd genuinely helped before Haven House. The defense suggested that Curtis had acted alone, that he'd been running the prostitution operation behind the sisters' backs, that any evidence of the sisters' involvement had been fabricated by Curtis to reduce his own sentence. None of it worked. The evidence was too overwhelming, the testimony too consistent, the archives file too damning. On March 15th, after 11 hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty verdicts on all counts for both sisters: human trafficking, coerced prostitution, racketeering, kidnapping, and 5 counts each of first-degree murder. The sentencing hearing was held 3 weeks later. The judge allowed victim impact statements. Sierra spoke about the 6 weeks she'd lived in terror, about the nightmares she still had, about how learning to trust people again felt impossible. Jasmine spoke about Crystal, about the friend she'd lost, about the guilt she carried for not acting sooner. Alexis spoke about all 17 women whose names were in that file, about how they deserved better than to be reduced to disposal notes, about how their lives had value that the sisters had tried to erase. Then family members spoke. Crystal's mother, who'd last seen her daughter 8 months before she disappeared, who'd believed Crystal had relapsed and abandoned her child. Trinity's sister, who'd been told Trinity had run away with a boyfriend, who'd spent 2 years angry at Trinity for not staying in touch before learning her sister had been murdered. The testimony went on for hours, a litany of grief and loss and anger and pain. When it was finally the sisters' turn to speak, Diane stood and apologized. She cried, claimed she'd lost her way, said she'd never meant for things to go so far. She blamed Curtis, blamed the stress of running to house, blamed her own childhood trauma. The judge was unmoved. Margaret refused to speak at all, standing silent with an expression that suggested she regretted only getting caught. The judge sentenced each sister to life without the possibility of parole on the murder charges, with additional consecutive sentences for the trafficking and kidnapping charges. Even if the murder convictions were somehow overturned, they'd still die in prison. Curtis received 45 years after pleading guilty and testifying against the sisters. He'd be 73 years old before he'd even be eligible for parole. Haven House was seized by the city and eventually demolished. The lot sat empty for a year before a coalition of actual anti-trafficking organizations purchased it and built a legitimate safe house, one with oversight and transparency and connections to real social services. They named it Crystal's Place, after the first woman who'd tried to expose the sisters. A plaque outside tells her story and the stories of the other women who died. Every resident who comes through Crystal's Place learns about the women who were murdered there, learns that exploitation can hide behind the kindness of people, learns to recognize the warning signs of trafficking. Sierra went back to school and became a lawyer specializing in prosecuting trafficking cases. She works with the district attorney's office now, using her insider knowledge of how traffickers operate to build better cases. She's put 14 traffickers in prison in the 5 years since the Everhart trial. She keeps a photograph of all 17 women from the archives file on her desk, a reminder of why she does this work. Jasmine struggled more. The trauma of Haven House combined with the guilt of surviving when Crystal and others didn't led to severe PTSD and depression. She spent 2 years in therapy, learning to process what she'd experienced, learning that survival wasn't something to feel guilty about. She works now as a peer counselor for trafficking survivors, meeting women where they are, understanding their fear in ways most counselors can't. She's helped 63 women escape trafficking situations. She calls it paying Crystal's courage forward. Alexis went back to school, got her GED, and then a degree in social work. She runs a nonprofit now that provides emergency housing for women fleeing domestic violence and trafficking, but with built-in safeguards to prevent the kind of exploitation the Everharts practiced. Transparent finances, board oversight, connections to legal services and law enforcement, background checks on all staff, everything designed to ensure that help is actually help, not another trap. She named her organization after Trinity, after the second woman who disappeared, the one whose death had convinced Jasmine that action was necessary. The three of them still talk regularly, bound by trauma but also by triumph. They saved each other in that garden at 3 a.m. when they decided to trust each other. They saved themselves when they ran across that roof and jumped for the oak tree branch. And they saved countless future victims by having the courage to come forward with evidence, even when they knew the sisters had power and connections, and every reason to destroy them. Detective Maria Chen kept working trafficking cases, but she never forgot the 3 women who'd walked into that convenience store in their pajamas, clutching proof of 17 murders. She'd seen a lot of victims over her career, but she'd seen few survivors with that kind of courage. She testified at the trial, explaining how she'd verified the evidence, how she'd built the case, how she'd believed the women when the entire city wanted to believe the Angel sisters. After the conviction, Chen received a commendation. She keeps it in a drawer. What matters to her is the photograph on her desk, the one showing her with Sierra, Jasmine, and Alexis at the opening of Crystal's place. That's the real reward. The story of the Everhart sisters spread beyond the city. Documentaries were made, books were written. The case became a teaching tool for recognizing trafficking, for understanding how predators use institutional respectability as camouflage, for knowing that sometimes the people who claim to be saving victims are actually creating them. The case changed laws, led to better oversight of residential programs for vulnerable women, created mandatory reporting requirements that might have exposed the sisters' operation years earlier. But for the women who lived through it, who survived it, who carry it with them every day, the story is simpler and more personal. It's about the moment you decide you'd rather die trying to escape than live one more day as a victim. It's about finding one other person who believes you when the world doesn't. It's about choosing to trust the evidence of your own eyes over the comforting lies that powerful people tell. It's about running when running seems impossible. It's about surviving when survival means carrying unbearable knowledge. Years later, on the anniversary of the night they escaped Haven House, Sierra and Jasmine and Alexis meet at Crystal's place. They light 17 candles, one for each woman in the file. They say the names aloud because someone needs to remember, someone needs to bear witness, someone needs to insist that these women mattered. Crystal Mendez, Trinity Washington, Amber Jones, Kiara Davis. Names that should have been forgotten, erased, reduced to disposal notes. Names that are remembered now because 3 women risked everything to tell the truth. The candles flicker in the darkness. The women hold hands, and they make the same promise they've made every year since the trial ended, that as long as they're alive, the women who died at Haven House will not be forgotten, that their deaths will mean something, that their stories will save others, that the exploitation and murder that the Everhart sisters called business will be called what it really was: evil, systematic, and preventable. The world is full of predators who disguise themselves as saviors. The world is full of victims who blame themselves for being victimized. The world is full of people who'd rather believe comforting lies than uncomfortable truths. But the world is also full of survivors who refuse to stay silent, who gather evidence, who run through the darkness toward an uncertain freedom, who choose truth over safety and justice over survival. Sierra and Jasmine and Alexis are three of those survivors. They ran from a house where angels were demons and help was horror. They ran with nothing but evidence and determination. They ran toward a detective who believed them when belief could have cost her career. They ran all the way to a courtroom where they told the truth under oath while their abusers watched. They ran. They fought. They won. And their victory echoes in every trafficking survivor who hears their story and thinks, maybe, just maybe, escape is possible. It echoes in every detective who takes a victim's statement seriously, even when the accused seems respectable. It echoes in every lawyer who prosecutes traffickers, every counselor who helps survivors heal, every person who chooses to believe victims over institutions. The Everhart sisters are in prison. They will die there. Curtis is in prison. He will die there. Haven House is gone, replaced by something real and honest and safe. The 17 women whose names were in that file are remembered, honored, mourned. Their deaths are not forgotten. Their murders are not unsolved. Their lives, however abbreviated, are not erased. And 3 women who were supposed to be victims became survivors. 3 women who were supposed to be silent became witnesses. 3 women who were supposed to disappear became the reason the Everhart sisters will never hurt anyone again. That is the power of courage. That is the power of truth. That is the power of refusing to accept that predators win and victims lose and evil triumphs. Sometimes when survivors find each other, when they trust each other, when they fight together, evil loses. Sometimes justice prevails. So, at times the women run fast enough, fight hard enough, survive long enough to see their abusers in prison and their own lives rebuilt. This is one of those times. This is the story of the Everhart sisters, who ran a brothel where women disappeared. But more importantly, it's the story of Sierra and Jasmine and Alexis, who refused to disappear, who ran toward freedom instead, who brought 17 murdered women out of the darkness and into the light, who proved that even when evil seems untouchable, even when predators seem protected, even when victims seem powerless, courage can change everything. They ran, they survived, they won. And their victory belongs to every survivor who's still running, still fighting, still believing that freedom is possible. You are not alone. You are not powerless. You are not forgotten. And like Sierra and Jasmine and Alexis, you can run toward the light. You can find people who believe you. You can escape. You can survive. You can win. Run, fight, survive, win. The Everhart sisters thought they'd taken everything from the women in Haven House. But they couldn't take the one thing that mattered most, the determination to be free. That determination, in the end, was stronger than chains, stronger than cameras, stronger than fear, stronger than death itself. That determination brought down 2 serial killers and saved countless lives. That determination is available to everyone who needs it. You just have to choose it. You just have to run.